Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's Scrum Pulse. My name is Dave West. I'm going to be your moderator, which is an ever so exciting role. So before we begin, and I know that everybody's here to not hear me at all, but to hear some of our co-presenters here, I just want to make sure we go through some logistics. So a little bit of overview details of how you use this GoToWebinar technology. Your microphones are muted, so we're not going to hear the sort of dog barking in the background or somebody providing you a cup of coffee whilst you're on today's webinar. So they're muted. That doesn't mean, though, you cannot communicate with us. There are a number of different ways that you can actually provide us with feedback, ask questions, etc. You will see there's a questions little tab in your GoToWebinar thing. You can go to that and you can type questions, and you can see how you can do that. Or if you want to be a little bit more interactive, a little bit more Snapchatty, you can go to the chat box and type things in there. We'll be trying to monitor it. We've got a few people on that can help. Any technical questions around guideline, recordings or using browsers or whatever, feel free to just pop them in and we have some technical support. This will be recorded, so if halfway through you're dragged off by some sort of disaster or crisis, you'll be able to come back to it later. We'll send you a link after today's webinar. So hopefully that makes sense. So I want to move into, hang on a minute, who are we? So this is Scrum.org, this is a Scrum Pulse webinar. I think you know who we are. That's probably the reason why you're here. We're the organization that does trains about 3,000, almost 4,000 people a month all around the world. Certification, we validate that with certification, as you can see there. Actually, PSU is part of this slide now, which we're going to be talking about today, which is very good. And then we have this amazing community of professional Scrum trainers, of which we have one on the line today. And all of this was created by my boss, Ken Schwaber, the co-creator of Scrum. So I think you know that. So I want to zoom into who's actually talking today, not me. Well, I'll be doing some moderation, trying to glue this thing together, trying to make sure that your experience is amazing. But actually, the real meat of today's Scrum Pulse are some awesome presenters. We've got Josh here and Jeff, the co-authors of Lean UX and also Sense and Respond. Interestingly, before I let them say hello, when I read Lean UX, it blew my mind. It was just like, hang on, this is Scrum, this is Agile, this works so well, this seems to make sense. And I was fortunate enough to get in contact with Jeff, who then introduced me to Josh. And over the last year, they've definitely broadened my horizons, as it were. We're also with Gary Pedretti, one of our professional Scrum trainers, one of this community, who worked with Jeff and Josh on actually building this new Clash. So Josh, do you want to say hi to the audience?
Hi to the audience.
So that's Josh. You're gonna you'll get that. And Jeff, do you want to say hi? Jeff's actually from speaking to us from Barcelona. So
that's right. Big match down the street this evening with Manchester United in town to take on FC Barcelona. But hey, folks, nice to see everybody. Good to be here. And it is impressive how the impact that Lean UX has had, Dave. It's nice to hear you talk about it. I was on a conversation earlier today with somebody who said, oh, look, I've had this book for 6 years and it's still relevant to my day-to-day work. So excited to be here, and I've really enjoyed the collaboration with Gary and Scrum.org.
Yeah, and Gary, our PST, who's been working with Jeff and Josh, I want to say hi to the audience.
Hi from snowy Chicago.
Oh yes, Gary's from Chicago, where it's a little bit snowy at the moment. So I actually just want to actually hand it over to Gary, and who'll set the sort of scene, set the table, as it were, for this conversation we're having. He's got about 5 minutes of material to talk a little bit about our work around professional Scrum for UX. Gary.
Okay, there it is. Just waiting for you to advance the slide. So what's the PSU? You keep hearing this PSU, Professional Scrum with User Experience. This is a 2-day class. It's an in-person class. Like most Scrum.org classes, it is a combination of theory and practice. There is a case study which threads throughout the 2 days where you get to learn about the techniques that we teach by doing the techniques. And the idea is to bridge the gaps between Scrum, UX, and design practices. And in Scrum, all products have a vision. So you shouldn't be surprised to hear that the PSU course has a vision. And here are some excerpts from that vision in terms of the purpose, the why, and the target audience, or the who. So the purpose is to experience how UX and Scrum can align and integrate so that everyone on the Scrum team can connect more closely with end users, customers, so that we can create truly cross-functional teams. The idea of a designer working on the same team as a coder, as a tester, as a BA, as a technical writer, as a data person, etc. How to work effectively within a sprint, as opposed to maybe designers always doing work ahead of people that are doing stuff in sprints, or ahead of or behind. Having that entire cross-functional team work within a sprint, and then balance both discovery and delivery work. Discovery and delivery. The audience, two primary audiences there: Scrum practitioners who are struggling to integrate UX and to think about discovery and things like that inside of a Scrum wrapper, and UX practitioners who are struggling to work inside the Scrum framework, especially working inside of sprints, inside the same sprint that the rest of the Scrum team is working. So there's the why and the who. And some of you might be sitting back and thinking, well, there's really not that much difference between the underlying principles or what these things are going for. And to you, I say, bravo. And we agree. There's a common foundation between Scrum and UX. Empiricism, evidence, value-driven, customer-driven, right? And in Scrum, we know that value is defined by the customer. So those are very similar, if not the same thing. Cross-functional teams, UX talks about cross-functional collaboration, etc. Inspect and adapt, sense and respond. There seems to be a great alignment between ideas from both of these things. And yet, when we try to put them together in the real world, sometimes we run up against some resistance or some mismatch, if you will. And when you look at this, you see some sort of tactical visualizations of Scrum, and then of a lean startup, lean UX type flow over here on the right. And yeah, we find that people struggle to put these things together, and it can relate to a bunch of different things. If you advance the slide there, Dave. And those are the sort of things that we talk about in the PSU, figuring out how to do continuous learning, not just, well, let's do some discovery and build something and hope it works out all right. Well, we need to close that feedback loop. We need to come back. Framing the work as problems to solve, as opposed to we're just going to define a bunch of features and then you go and build them. Thinking about outcomes over outputs. We'll talk about that when we talk about the definition and things like that here today. But the idea is you can build something, that's an output, but you don't know yet whether it has changed customer behavior, and that's your real target. Managing UX work within Scrum, especially UX work maybe that designers are feeling this would have to span multiple sprints, etc., and or this is very specialized work and only designers should do it, things like that. How do we want to manage UX work inside of Scrum? And thinking about users, personas, the customer, and building experiments finally, and getting to a state of, what some people might call hypothesis-driven development, but the idea of getting hypotheses and experiments into the work that you're actually doing. So instead of a Scrum team just building features, they are building stuff with an idea of disproving or proving out a hypothesis that they have. And that has implications in terms of how your backlog looks, how product backlog refinement looks, how an individual product backlog item looks as it goes through different stages and gets refined, etc. So these are a good collection of the course topics here in the PSU. What we'd like to do now is just kind of have some general conversation around some of these challenges. I think that you'll find, I know working with Jeff and Josh, that I think you'll find that listening to them talk and having a conversation here is probably going to provide you a lot of value in terms of ideas that you can turn around and use, actionable ideas. And these are the sort of things that we talk about and that we cover in the 2-day PSU.
So thanks, Gary. That sort of set the table, providing the foundations. That's awesome. And these are some of the questions. Now, feel free, audience, to, this is actually a real time. These people are really here. They're not holograms or recordings. So feel free to reach out with any particular questions. You'll see me looking over to the question list in a moment. But to get started, I'd really like to actually pose something to Jeff, really. And it's something that one thing that really frustrates the heck out of me when I see Scrum being implemented in many organizations where they've got the design team over there, or even in their own team, but they're working on a completely different sprint. You've got this sort of like concept of design sprints and staggered sprints, that kind of model. So how does, Lean UX and this class talks very differently about this. So how do you get rid of the staggered sprints? Jeff, do you want us to start that conversation?
Absolutely. Look, the staggered sprint model is, unfortunately, it's a misunderstanding of what the ultimate vision of Scrum and UX should be together. It came out of a paper that was written by Lynn Miller and Desiree C. back in 2007, where they described a cross-functional collaboration between software engineering teams, Scrum teams, and designers. Unfortunately, the paper was misunderstood to say that the designers should always work a sprint ahead and then hand off to the developers, who will then work on the thing that the designers just worked on, while the designers work on the next sprint's worth of stuff. What I've seen over the years and the experience that we've had is that, look, that's a step better than waterfall, but it's not the destination where you want to end up. The reason is because what you're actually doing in this particular case is you're just making the waterfall smaller. You're still doing waterfall. The designers are working, you're doing kind of rapids, right, if you will, but the baby waterfalls. And so the designers are going to work on something for a sprint, right? And at the end of that sprint, they are then going to hand that off to a development team that has never seen that material before. At which point the designers have to then convince the developers to implement this, to do it exactly the way that it was designed, and to do it within the scope of the next sprint, making the assumption that whatever they designed in that sprint can take place in one single time box moving forward. Now, inevitably, that's going to break down. And inevitably, that's going to engender the same kinds of conversations that designers and developers have in a waterfall world, which largely starts with the word no. And then we work backwards from there, right? And so the stuff ends up getting cut. Engineers say, well, that's a really nice design, but we can't implement that. We've got other priorities and so forth. And so the quantity of waste that begins to take place in that process goes up. And that's the real challenge with staggered sprints. And so you're reducing the time frame, but all the same challenges of waterfall are still in the same place. The way that we start to get rid of staggered sprints feels really simple. I'm going to say it very simply, but it's not an easy thing to implement. It's to get designers and developers working on the same team on the same thing at the same time, right? Now, that's it. No more staggered sprints, right? Problem solved. But that's not. It's not nearly as easy as that, as we all know. But the benefits there are exponential, right? So if we've got designers, developers, product managers, or product owners working together on the same thing at the same time, they are building a shared understanding of the problem that they're solving, the customer they're solving it for, and what success looks like. Now, what happens when they do that is all of that conversation. Why are we working on this? Why are we designing it this way? Why are we building it this way? All of that gets thrown out. and the team can focus on the conversations that actually make doing our jobs fun, right? The conversations around why are we doing this, look, in my experience, have never been a ton of fun for me as a designer and as a design leader and a product manager and so forth, right? The fun conversations are, we've identified these challenges. We've identified what the customer is trying to do. What are we going to do about it together as a team? How can we find the best combination of code, copy, design that will solve the problem for the customer? And so that shared understanding allows us to move faster, to cut out a good percentage of the work, and to reduce the waste. So designers aren't working on things that'll never get implemented. Engineers don't have to push back nearly as hard on things that will never see the light of day for a variety of reasons. And so the more that we can get this cross-functional collaboration to take place at the same time on the same set of stories, backlog material, right? That's the same iterations worth of work, the less we need the staggered sprint model, and it starts to drift away.
So just to, I mean, it seems to make sense, though. It sort of, as a project manager, back in the day, I'd feel a little bit. It sounds a little inefficient and messy. Gary, you talk about this all the time with your clients, and as a professional Scrum trainer, do they get a little bit uncomfortable because they got these really expensive, cool, good-looking, as proven here with Josh and Jeff, good-looking design people wandering around? Sort of, doesn't it feel like we're not using them to the most efficient way in this way? Is that some pushback that you get?
Yeah, absolutely. And if you're focused on utilization, right? If you're focused on utilization, meaning I want coders to be coding 100% of the time, I want testers to be testing 100% of the time, I want designers to be designing 100% of the time, and that's your only focus, that's your only metric for whether I'm quote unquote efficiently using my resources, then yes, this will look very odd to you, and it will be very perhaps painful or counterintuitive to you. But the point isn't utilization. The point is throughput, right? The point is working stuff to done and getting customers happy. And in order to do that, there needs to be shared understanding across all people that are in that chain. And the way you do that is by bringing them together. It's hard from a bunch of different reasons, for a bunch of different angles. You mentioned the management angle. It's also within the teams. I hear people, the dev team members say, "Why don't you just finalize the design and tell me what you want me to build?" And I really do believe, actually, that there are people that say that, and they only say that because they've kind of been conditioned to that's the way things are going to work, and they've been conditioned because that's where the incentives are, and we need to change that.
So it's funny. Keith online just said it's waterfall in Agile Pants is what he described it as, which I think was a funny way of describing it. Who doesn't want Agile Pants, as it were? But Josh, something designers, do they not like this, or do they like this? Are they Gary talked a little bit about the management and talked about developers don't trust these super smart kind of customer centric dudes running into their team. What about designers? I mean, surely it's perfect to be separate and to be staggered and to have clear deliverables, right?
Sure. We like to live in our caves and emerge with beautiful Photoshop drawings. No, I mean, look, everybody wants to do good work. That's sort of my starting assumption. And then it's just a question of sort of, sometimes we lose sight of what it means to do good work. And we think doing good work means, well, we have to do this thing that we were taught. And so one of the challenges for designers, and I think it's the sort of fundamental insight of lean UX, is that when you're working in an agile context, your work changes. You can't do the same thing you always did, but faster, right? You actually have to change the way you design. And so some designers are very flexible and very happy to make that change. And for example, instead of getting everything polished perfectly in Photoshop, your work is much more about engaging and facilitating the work of your team, right? It's about developing ideas on a whiteboard together. That's design, right? Design on a whiteboard and design on in Photoshop, they're still design, but some people love to make beautiful things in Photoshop, the same way some engineers, they don't want to talk to anybody, they just want to get lost in the code, right?
Yeah.
It's the same thing for all of us. And so I think the people who make the transition successfully are the ones that can step back and say, what does it mean to do a good job in this context? And how do I respond flexibly, you know? And I think the people who succeed are the ones that, you know, kind of are in love with making great stuff at the end of the day.
Yeah. So ultimately, if you can persuade everybody or remind everybody on the team what the outcome is that you seek, and focus everybody on that, then you just work as in the most natural way to do that, which is collaboratively, as you all have said. So, and I do have some other questions around this, but I do want to get to the definition of done, which I think will pick up some of these questions. And Gary, as the official Scrum priest on the call, I'm surprised you're not wearing your robes. I'm a little embarrassed because I bought those specially for you. But the definition of done, you know, it's this is an important thing. It's, you know, part of the Scrum Guide. It says you will deliver your work to this definition of done. Otherwise, the sprint is a failure and life does not, you know, carry on. So how does it have an impact on definition of done? You know, this.
Yeah. So number one, I'm not wearing robes because that's not my thing. And I know Dave.
Sorry, I was joking, Gary. I know.
I know. Well, there's actually an important point here. I know that Dave was joking, but a big thing in the PSU that we've done, and the thing that I've done, Eric Weber is my co-steward on the Scrum.org side for this class, and something that was very important for us, and we've talked about a lot, and we've put it into the trainer guidance and things like that, is that we're building bridges here. We're building bridges to the designer community and other people who have only heard sort of things like, well, Scrum says you do it all in a sprint, so just do it in a sprint, make it happen. And designers and other people, all kinds of specialties, have that over and over again. And they're true, but they're not helpful. And where we're going to start from is having a discussion about things that, what do you think might take longer than you think? Where do you think the people are wearing too many white robes? Right? Where's the dogma getting in the way of us being able to do things effectively? And we can talk about that. And actually, from the perspective of the Scrum people, that's actually the best thing to do, because we want to hear the objections to that. We want to learn about the work that people really feel doesn't fit into a Scrum wrapper, so that we understand what that is, and maybe that will be what will allow us to help us best bring stuff into the Scrum wrapper, is to understand what's really there. So I know you were joking, but there's an important point there, and I know you know this too, Dave. Is that this is a olive branch, or this is a bridge building sort of class around a lot of frustration that both designers and builders sort of using Scrum framework have. So
yeah, so tell me then a little bit about, though, you mentioned a couple of interesting points. One is work. You know, customers are tricky devils, right, guys? We all get that. So, you know, the design ultimately is about, you know, empirically learning about your customer, feeding that back in, and continuously you have this design, you test it, you're like, oh my God, we're wrong there. That doesn't always fit in 2 weeks, right? Does it? Tell me, how do you fit? Is it part of your definition of done? Is it not? How does it all fit together when you've got this sort of complex kind of work, Gary?
Yeah, and you're right. In that this question ties back to your previous one about the definition of. So let's just set the table there for a second. What the definition of done says, or the idea behind the definition of done, is getting a objective sort of standard around what it means to be releasable. And releasable, right? Or potentially shippable. Some people have said, I think the official word in the Scrum Guide is releasable. Who cares? Releasable is different than validated. Releasable is different than released, but releasable is kind of where the gold standard of Scrum is, and it kind of stops there. And things like DevOps and a primary enabling pattern of DevOps continuous delivery have taken, they're a natural evolution of this. I love those communities. They're a natural evolution of this in going from the gold standard of being releasable to the gold standard of being released. And for some people, that has changed their definition of done. If they're doing continuous delivery with a Scrum wrapper, which is a completely valid concept and beyond the scope of this conversation, but if you those things that are odds, reach out to someone. We can help you with that. That might change their definition of done. But ultimately, the first thing that we need to know is that we need to go beyond releasable, right, to be effective. And that doesn't mean we don't need Scrum. It doesn't mean we don't do Scrum. It means there's something, and there's Scrum and there's something else, right? And we have build something, we have make it releasable, we have release, and then we have validated. We can only validate whether it's actually delivering value to the customer after it has been released. And so that's where we start talking about, we need to go beyond the definition of done, because most teams, a team could define this however they want, but most teams out in the field are defining their definition of done only to the releasable state. Okay. Now to go to your next, your sort of follow-on question, which is, okay, well then how does this happen? When do we, does that all happen within a sprint? Things like that. And the answer to that, of course, is it depends. But if you have a continuous line, something like that, and you're doing multiple releases inside of a sprint, you very well could be doing validation of those same features, of those same product backlog items. You could be doing that same sprint. You could be. For some people, maybe they don't release as often, and so the opportunity for validation doesn't come until later. Then in that case, maybe we track that work on the product backlog as stuff that we need to follow up on and validate that. Or maybe it's something that we just consider general product owner work, and the product owner will take a look at usage stats. The product owner will reach out. The product owner will look at surveys, et cetera, about whether these things are providing value. So the answer of kind of how you structure that is it depends. And that, again, to tie back to the class, there's a lot of questions that we ask around things like this. And we sort of poll the audience and understand what people are currently doing or what their current thoughts are. And then we provide some theory, and we provide some guidance around some of these things.
Okay, so
answer your question?
Yeah, I just sort of summarize. So definition of done, the tension that creates, usually, in terms of potentially releasable, is now sort of on steroids. Going like, well, how do we get information back from this? How do we get feedback? How do we validate it? Let's have those conversations. Let's bring those things up to make sure that we're doing what's best in terms of value, etc. I think that was really, really interesting. And the bottom line is that, yes, of course, software is going to be used throughout its time outside the context of a sprint. Feeding that information back either through the product owner or through refinement exercises of that learning and sharing it is key. Having those conversations is what it's all about. Which brings us, I guess, to having the right people in the team. We've got the dedicated designer here. Dedicated designers. I always think dedicated followers of fashion when I see that, but dedicated, and often they are. Dedicated designers. So, Josh, I know you've got some strong experience around who's on the team, dedicated versus specialist versus, enablers. Tell the audience a little bit, or share with the audience a little bit about your experience with dedicated designers and really the team makeup, really. Josh.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Dave. If you go back to Jeff's answer when we were talking about staggered sprints, what he said was, look, you need to get everybody on the team working together, collaborating, to design as a team, right? You're making a product together. And so we advocate that kind of, building a cross-functional team, those sorts of cross-functional collaborations. And then people always ask, well, that's great, but in my company, we don't have enough designers. So what do you do when there aren't enough designers? How does Lean UX solve that, or how does Scrum UX solve that? And my answer is always, Lean UX and Scrum don't solve that, right? What solves not having enough designers is hiring enough designers, right? And so
no, you lie. This is a magic bullet.
Well, I think people expect process to solve every problem, right? And process doesn't solve every problem, right? Process, sorry, I'm not going to take this off in a ranty direction, but the thing is, if you look at your team is designing. Whether there's a designer on your team or not, your team is designing. If you are building software that is consumed by other software, you're building an API, right? You are designing that API. You should be designing that API with your customers in mind, right? Those customers are the other developers who are writing software that consume your service. So there's no excuse for teams not to be customer-centric. And there's no context in which teams are not designing. So then the question is, how do you get the right design expertise on your team at the right time? So you heard my first answer, which is hire the right people, right? The second answer is that in all of this, and I said this earlier, designers' roles change from being the people who produce pixel perfect drawings to the people who to a more facilitative role, right? And so that's true, by the way, for user researchers as well. We talk a lot about design, but a lot of user experience is working with users to understand what they need, and that's often done by specialty researchers. Specialty researchers often complain, like, look, I do this amazing research, I package it up in this beautiful report, and nobody reads it, right? Yeah. So what happens is you need to be able to help the team build its capability, right? And so in places where you're under-resourced, your job becomes the design team's job or the research team's job changes from doing all the design or doing all the research to leading teams through that process and helping teams build that capability internally and helping teams get good at recognizing when they lack that capability and figuring out how to go get it. Can we embed a designer with us for this 4-week period where we really need user interface work? Can we embed a researcher with us for these couple of sprints, right? Otherwise, we can kind of handle this stuff ourselves for a little while.
It's interesting because I ultimately believe that everybody is responsible for helping others to get better at their craft, and designers' job is to spread the designers' ideas and little tools like Studio and some stuff in your book, those sort of tools, and sharing them, and then running little exercises. I say little, running exercises with the team to do that, right? And to get them proficient, because ultimately it isn't, I hope that the modern world isn't about individuals being like, I'm really, really good at this and nobody else, and I'm going to hoard this skill. It should be, in fact, about individuals helping others with the skills that they've really got, in my opinion.
Right. And I think one of the things that we've seen along those lines, Dave, is that the sort of what it means to be a designer today is different from what it means to be a designer 10 years ago. 10 years ago, a generalist designer in the digital space probably didn't know, maybe was just starting to get familiar with front-end development technology. These days, a generalist designer working in technology, there's a strong expectation that they're going to know front end. They're going to be able to build some stuff for the front end, if not be actually a really capable front end developer. So the point is, it's not one skill per and one individual, but you have these multi-skilled individuals who come in and cover the skill sets you need to create an effective team.
And so,
hey,
how did
Josh?
Sorry.
Okay.
If I could, Dave. Josh, I've answered questions like this one for people like architects and database people and things like that in the past. I'm interested in your opinion here, you sharing your opinion here about the designer aspect of it. And the basic question is, how could you trust, why would you want somebody who doesn't have that specialty to do the work? And you mentioned studies here and researchers. And the thing that I hear a lot is, why would I turn somebody loose on doing research, right? So we spread that work around a little bit, more people get involved, whatever. Why would I send somebody loose on research work if they aren't a specialist and they don't understand how they might be introducing bias, as one example? How do you respond to that sort of stuff in the designer specialty, the designer world?
So I think a lot of this is about kind of self-awareness and humility. I think that for teams need to have the self-awareness to say, like, okay, look, research is more than just talking to people, right? Research, there's an actual skill there, and none of us here are researchers, right? Let's go talk to a researcher and figure out how to do this right? And then working with the researcher, you can build a plan to do it right. For a researcher, they also need to have the humility to say, like, okay, look, you know what? Like, I went to school for this. I have a doctorate in this, but like, it's just kind of a special case of talking to people, right? like both of those things are true. It's more than talking to people, but it's also just talking to people. And so how do you give teams enough skill so that they can move forward with some independence, but also work together to build that muscle and know when you have to, oh, this one's really hard, we better call in the specialist. So I think it requires a little bit of trust, a little bit of humility on both sides. And I think so.
Yeah, it is interesting though, because ultimately, if you want the perfection, and you want to specialize, and you try to do that and see how successful it gets, because you're going to end up with research studies, and we see this over and over again. I promise not to talk much, but I'm going to. We see this over and over again. You get massive amount of research. I remember when I was at a large IT organization back in the day, you get this huge amount of research. The research should take 2 years to compile. You get the data, but by this point, everything's moved on. And then you're like, well, that's really interesting, but we're not selling to that market anymore in the same way. So brilliant stuff, loved it, but it doesn't really apply anymore. Whereas if you can just increase the cadence, just get enough skills to not totally get it wrong, then I think you're in a much better position, I guess.
And I think you also have to recognize, like, what are you making, right? Are you making a shopping cart, a shopping app that lets you buy pet food, right? Or are you designing the control systems of a passenger jet? Those are really different, research and validation scenarios, and they have really, really significantly different consequences. So, I think one of the things that we do in the sort of agile world and in the the lean startup world is we're big advocates for this, scientific thinking. And I do think we're sort of using the scientific method, right? But only a few of us are actually working on, curing cancer, right?
Yeah.
So,
Science.
Yeah, but it's interesting though. I mean, obviously, it's very in the news at the moment, Boeing and some of the challenges that they've had, but and design features in that, I think, in terms of feedback and information to the pilots, etc. But what's interesting is that but you don't solve that by breaking it all up into these huge stages and getting really experts to, well, we've got to work, because the problem is that there's such a symbiotic relationship between design, the feature, the function, how the technology is implemented, the compromises that are inevitably going to be made as you're trying to push to get your product out, because you've just sold 5,000 planes to whoever. The reality is that the best way of doing that is to empower and build cross-functional teams that have humility. I think, Josh, what you said was really, really crucial, to say, hey, I don't totally know. How about I call on some experts to help me in this situation, and get some help as necessary. So we've had like 100 comments on skills, cross-functional skills, how we do that. Hopefully, maybe we'll come back to this in a little while, but I do want us to move on. And something that, Jeff, you talk a lot about, I was recently in London with you, around learning, doing, how you balance the work. And I know that all of you got an opinion on this, as a software engineer by vocation or by aspiration, I think now it's not even vocation, I like to just get in my little room and just do my stuff. But then there's this learning stuff, there's this, building complete code, how does it all fit together? What happens if can I have a whole sprint where I'm just learning? Oh, that sounds awful.
Yeah, that's terrible.
I haven't done that ever in my entire life. But Jeff, have you got some comments on this?
Sure. So a couple thoughts. So we're talking about discovery work and delivery work. And one time at a job, I saw it shortened as disco and deli. And let's never do that again. I just want to be clear.
I kind of like it. Okay, sorry. Yeah.
Disco and deli. Disco is it's kind of both fun. One's dancing, one's delicious.
Yeah.
Anyway, look, a couple things to talk about here, right? So the buzzword, or the phrase that a lot of teams have been using over the last few years is dual track agile. Dual track agile being exactly this. It's a balance of doing the discovery work, the learning work, and the delivery work, which is the actual production of the releasable and released software, as Gary called it. Now, a couple misconceptions here that and to think about. First of all, it's two types of work, but it's one team doing that work. So let's be very clear. There is not a discovery team and a delivery team. At least there shouldn't be. Let's be clear about that. That there are, in many companies, there's the discovery team, and then they hand off to the IT team that's somewhere, usually in another country. But in an ideal sense, the things that we teach in a class are focused on one team doing both kinds of work. So then how do you do that? Well, there's a couple of things to keep in mind here. First and foremost, and perhaps controversial, perhaps not, one backlog. Period. End of story. Yeah, sorry. I don't know if the Scrum universe just broke.
God, I hope not. As I'm sitting on top of it.
Right. Yeah. What's the status at Scrum HQ, Dave? Dave is like hurricane force winds. Well. Standing in the hurricane. Yeah.
Nobody mentions any one product backlog.
Right. And some people say, well, that's great, Jeff, but is this really one kind of, can you do that? The answer is absolutely yes, you can do that. And in fact, the anti-pattern, if you divide discovery work and delivery work into two separate backlogs, or even more, some people do it even more than that, what you end up with is you either divide the team into a discovery team and a delivery team. And if you do that, you're back to staggered sprints. You've got a team doing discovery and design and then handing off to IT. And we talked about that earlier, to delivery teams. And the other thing that you may end up doing is you inevitably, that team has to pull work from one of those backlogs. And inevitably, without fail, one of those backlogs is going to be the one they go to every day. And the other one is going to be the one they neglect. And I guarantee you 100% of the time, the one they'll neglect ultimately will be the discovery backlog. It just ends up being, and again, this is from my experience, both working in-house and as a consultant, the discovery backlog ends up becoming a confessional Right? There's a lot of religious themes in this discussion today, right? But that's really what it becomes. It's like, I'm really sorry we didn't do the research. I feel really bad we didn't do that good design work, right? And that's where it ends up. It ends up in that other backlog. So one backlog, and prioritize, and we treat that work, we visualize the discovery work exactly the same way as we treat the delivery work. If you write physical cards, it goes on a card. You write down what the work is. People get assigned to that work, and it gets moved. And if you do estimations, there's not enough time in the world to have that conversation. But if you do estimations, you size the card, right? And when that card is in play, when it's in your doing column, and there are people assigned to that work, they don't do something else. They do the discovery work. And the thing to remember is that as you're prioritizing discovery and delivery work against each other, you have to be explicit about where that discovery and design work fits into the backlog. For example, you may have an interface component that is very easy to design, like a checkbox. Let's add a checkbox to the screen. But the implications of checking that box technically are massive. So you're looking at 6 months worth of work, whether that checkbox is on or off. We have to have that cross-functional collaboration. The opposite might be true as well. You might have a design team or a designer on your team that's coming up with a fairly elaborate front end to your interaction, but a talented front end developer may be able to knock that out in a half day. And so we've got to have those conversations to understand, do we need to allow more time in the sprint for the design aspect of this card, or do we need to allow more time for the development aspect of this card? And so that conversation is absolutely critical as well. Now, the other reason why you want to explicitly prioritize the work in your backlog between discovery and delivery is that, especially with research activities, learning activities, whether they're A/B tests, customer conversations, prototypes, whatever you're doing, right? Stories, work that you prioritize below that discovery activity is explicitly at-risk work, because you may learn something in that discovery work that may destabilize the downstream prioritization of your backlog. Yep. And that's okay. That's agile, right? That's being agile. That's learning. That's something that we decided to do is not the best approach, and changing course, responding to change over following a plan, I believe, is what they said on that mountain all those years ago.
Yes, they did.
And so this is critical. And then this way, we've got one team working on the same set of work at the same time. And to answer the last thing that you said before the Scrum universe cracked in half here, yes, you can have a whole sprint dedicated to learning. We have a term for that in Scrum. It's called a spike, right? Now, a spike has technically meant a technical learning sprint. That's perfectly okay. We've got a thing called a design sprint these days, right? That might be a design and discovery learning sprint. It doesn't matter what you call it, but the concept exists. The type of learning that you put in there is whatever you need to know right now. And so again, the key takeaways here is one team, two kinds of work, one backlog, explicitly prioritized against each other in the exact same way. And yes, you can have a sprint dedicated to learning.
Wow, sorry, about 400 questions came in during this. But I just wanted a couple of things. Spikes are from XP, but same thing, same world. But what's interesting is that what we're saying is that the tension around building complete working software, learning about the customer, doing design, all of that needs to be in one place, managed, prioritized, defined by value and risk, managing that risk value sort of continuum on, we don't actually know, but we're going to have to launch because our competitors have done it, let's do it, kind of, sometimes you make decisions. There's a bit of a risk here. We don't actually know if this technology will scale. Again, you have to have these conversations in one place with one team driven by one product owner. I know, Gary, I see you nodding. Do you agree? I mean, that's the whole point, right?
Yeah, I agree, and I'll say something to agree with Jeff, and then I'll soften something that he said also a little bit, but still in agreement. But one of the ways to sum up some of the things that Jeff said is that learning is a first. Learning should be a first-class citizen. It needs to be. If you care about removing risk or mitigating risk, I hope that you understand that you need to learn sometimes. And we have a lot of people who will pay lip service to, oh yeah, learning's a first-class citizen, or we're a learning organization. You know, somebody read that in a book somewhere. We have people pay, but there's a point that we make inside the PSU at one point. We kind of stop and say, do you understand the implications of this? What this means is that there might be times where you deliver less stuff, right? If all you think about is stuff is features, there might be a time that you deliver less of that because you're going to do more learning. And do you understand the implications of that? And that's typically where managers and things like that start to change the song of, oh yeah, we're a learning organization. Oh wait, you don't want to deliver as much? No. You still got to deliver, you know? That's those sorts of things. Those statements are contradictory. You're not in a consistent state as an organization. And what I'll say to soften Jeff's thing is I wouldn't necessarily say that we have sprints where all we do is learning. We might have backlog items where all we do is learning. No big deal. But in the same way that we don't have like an architecture sprint, we probably want to shy away from having a learning sprint. And what we did with architecture there is we said that we could spend a lot of time on architecture, but we're going to do one small thing on top of those architectural decisions to prove out that this isn't completely crazy. And we're going to do that inside of a sprint. And I would suggest that you do that with your learning also. Do one small thing to take some action on what you learned. And it's not going to validate all the learning. It's not going to cover all of the learning, but it's going to prove out that some of this learning, this path that we went down, was valuable. Like, this was good. Okay, great. This is actionable learning. You want to be able to prove that out, and you can do that inside of that same sprint.
Yeah.
It's just a balance. That's all.
One comment here that was really sort of interesting learning for me on this topic as we built the course. You know, I think there's a lot of emphasis in Scrum on the done increment. You know, I mean, that's the center of everything. And, you know, in my experience working on high functioning teams, sometimes you put aside the done increment for a week or two, right? And you say like, okay, you know what, this is a moment when we're not building stuff. We're doing work, we're doing high value work, we're not building stuff, and then we're going to come back to it. That happens in a really high trust environment, and it happens in a high functioning environment where you know you can deliver. Anytime you want, you can just deliver, right? And I think a lot of the value of Scrum is that, this is one of the things that I realized during building this training, is that not everybody is fortunate enough to work in these high functioning, high trust environments, right? And so in those contexts, keeping a priority on delivery is really, really critical. And the notion of setting aside delivery and going 100% on learning for a week or two is terrifying, risky, and maybe ill-advised. But I think it's also a smell, right? It's a smell about the bigger issues in your organization. If it's such a risk for you and your team to stop delivering for a week, there's bigger things going on, right? And you need to pay attention to those.
That's really interesting. It's funny. I mean, what I heard over and over again, I hate to say Yodery, but sound all Yodery, but it's all about balance, right? If you want to deliver massive value to your customers, you have to balance all of these things and in the sprint, in the planning cycle of the sprint, delivering continuously and learning continuously, and balance all the things. And sometimes you're going to get it right, and you're going to keep on one foot even if it's windy, and then sometimes you're going to fall on your bum occasionally. You need to be in an environment, and I think that's what Josh said, in an environment that allows you to do that, and you have to trust that this environment is going to be, ultimately you're going to do the right thing. And it comes back to transparency. You know, that you, by having one backlog, what Jeff said about that is so important, because then you've got this focal point that you can see it visually, making it transparent to allow you to inspect and adapt. around it. That's pretty profound. I know we've got like another million questions that we're not going to answer, and I know we're coming up to our time. So I do want to, actually, I want to move my mouse over there. I do want to just sort of like bring this all together. We've got 5 minutes, and I just want to make sure that we've got an opportunity to sort of bring this home. Otherwise, it's just a bunch of smart, incredibly good-looking people talking on a webcast. Or that's probably another webcast happening at the moment. But so you heard it's all about continuous learning. This fact that we're in this cycle of learning and making that a first-class citizen. I don't know whether it was Gary or Jeff or even Josh that said first-class citizen. I heard it like multiple times. Learning is as important as architecture, as design. You know, it's a first-class citizen. Framing the work as problems to solve. I think it's so hard though, everybody. I'm a mere amateur, and I run the backlog here at Scrum.org, and I'm just like, oh, how do I reword this from telling people what to do and the thing that I've already got in my head to be about the problem? Ugh, it's really tricky, but the class teaches you a lot of techniques to do that. The t-shirt that Gary and Eric want to get printed, which is outcomes over outputs. I'm expecting that to be a new t-shirt at a conference near you at some point, because that's what it's about, right? Gary mentioned efficiency, right? He talked about stop focusing on trying to optimize every minute of the day of your designer or your developer. Josh also reinforced this. Concentrate on outcomes and allow them, smart people, to work out how they can use their best skills to do that. We talked a lot about how you manage the work. The one backlog, I think, is sort of like a moment. Drop the mic, I think, is that what the people do here in America? I don't know. Anyway, and then we talked we haven't talked much about personas, but we did talk a lot about the customer, and obviously persona being a technique to sort of make the customer real for people. But the fact that, Josh mentioned this and said, that keep the customer in your mind, focus on that. That's what it's all about. And you build experiments, you create hypothesis, you continuously refine that to try to understand that customer better. So we're coming up to our time. We've got 1 minute each. I'd love any last words? Gary, Pedretti, have you got any last words for the audience?
You mentioned the t-shirt idea. I'm not sure, maybe Eric telling you about that or something, I don't know. But yeah, if we're going to talk about religion here in white robes, like I definitely got the religion from Jeff and Josh, and the religion is outcomes over outputs. There's only one mantra that you need to memorize for this religion. It's really easy. I recommend everyone think about that. Outcomes over outputs. The other final thing I'll say is I'm going to channel the other steward who couldn't make it today, Eric Weber, and I'm going to say, you mentioned, Dave, hard. This is hard stuff to figure out. No one is saying that this stuff is easy. We're saying that the alternatives are much, much worse. And I'll channel Eric Weber here and say that you're all smart people. Okay? There's a reason why you're working. There's a reason why you're working for the company you're working for. There's a reason why you're on this team. We're all smart people. We can figure this out. And we can figure this out without having dogma, without having one true answer. We can figure this out by being truly adaptive, by trying things, seeing what works, and moving on. Cool. Trying other things or persevering. We're all smart people. Let's figure it out.
We're all smart people. Talking of a smart person, Jeff, any last words for the audience?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I think Josh and I have been having this conversation for 10 years, and but this is but to be clear, what I love about having it now is that this is the first time that we're having it in a context where an agile organization like Scrum.org has reached out and said, look, let's make this happen. Let's bring this to a much broader audience. Josh and I have been preaching kind of to the same people for a long time. So I'm really thrilled about this collaboration, and I'm optimistic that we'll be opening up this conversation to a much broader audience now, and doing what Gary said, is figuring this out.
Cool. Josh, last words of wisdom.
You're muted, Josh.
You're muted. That's just very
It's
sad.
probably better for everybody that way. Gary stole my thunder about outcomes over outputs. I just wrote a book on that. You should get it on Amazon. Jeff stole my thunder about working with Scrum.org. I'm so excited these communities are coming together. Sign up for the class. The conversations in the class are incredible, and you know, I'm really pleased with the way this has come together.
Great. Well, I'm really pleased from today's Scrum Pulse. Thanks ever so, Joshua, Jeff, Gary. Awesome. I could sit and talk to you forever because you're so smart and you've got so many great ideas. It isn't easy. It isn't. But at least let's start having the conversations. Let's start delivering value to our customers. Let's try balancing those demands and making it transparent. So thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your time. I'm sorry we didn't get to all your questions. There was like a million of them, all very awesome questions. I appreciate your time, and thank you for today's Scrum Pulse. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye, folks.
Bye.